The autumn of 1987 began like any other in the small town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, located just far enough from Pittsburgh to maintain its own distinct identity. But Millbrook had always prided itself on being the kind of place where people didn't lock their doors at night. A community where everyone knew everyone else's business, sometimes to a fault, but also where neighbors looked out for one another with genuine concern. September 14th dawned crisp and clear. The maple trees lining Woodhaven Elementary School's perimeter had just begun their annual transformation, a few scattered leaves already displaying hints of amber and crimson. Parents dropped their children off at the white brick building that morning, exchanging quick goodbyes and have a good days without a second thought. None could have possibly imagined that this unremarkable Monday would soon become the most infamous date in Millbrook's history. But by 3:45 that afternoon, 5 students had vanished without a trace. The missing children: Thomas Reed, 8, Eliza Warren, 9, Jeffrey Palmer, 8, Victoria Vicky Gunderson, 9, and Daniel Keating, 8, had last been seen during their shared 4th period art class. All 5 were 3rd graders from different homerooms who gathered twice weekly for specialized art instruction with the school's only art teacher, Eleanor Bryant. What made the disappearance particularly baffling was that all 5 children had been present for attendance after lunch. According to school records, they'd reported to room 117 for their 1:30 p.m. art class as scheduled. By final dismissal at 3:15 p.m., none of them had returned to their homerooms to collect their belongings. 5 empty desks, 5 unclaimed backpacks, 5 children who had seemingly vanished into thin air. The initial response was one of confusion rather than alarm. When Thomas Reed's mother arrived to pick him up and found him absent from the designated collection area, she assumed he'd boarded the wrong bus, a reasonable assumption for an 8-year-old still adjusting to the school year's new routines. She approached Thomas's homeroom teacher, Barbara Lambert, who checked the classroom only to find his Batman backpack still hanging on its assigned hook. Within 30 minutes, the school office had received 4 more calls from increasingly worried parents. By 4:30 p.m., Principal Robert Whitfield had contacted the Millbrook Police Department. By 6 p.m., the school had been transformed into a command center, with officers methodically searching every classroom, closet, bathroom, and crawl space in the building. They found nothing. The investigation began in earnest the following morning. Detective Samuel Lawson, a 17-year veteran of the Millbrook PD with a reputation for thoroughness, took charge of the case. His first priority was interviewing Eleanor Bryant, the art teacher who had last seen the missing children. Bryant, 47, had taught at Woodhaven for over a decade. Unmarried and somewhat eccentric, she lived alone in a small house near the town's only park. Students generally liked her, though some parents found her techniques unconventional. She focused less on traditional crafts and more on expression and creativity, an approach that occasionally raised eyebrows in the conservative community. According to Bryant's initial statement, the art class had proceeded normally that day. The children had been working on fall-themed collages using pressed leaves and construction paper. She remembered dismissing the class at 2:20 p.m., watching the students file out toward their homerooms for the final period of the day. They all left together, she told Detective Lawson, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a ceramic mug of tea. I stayed behind to clean up the glue and scissors. It was a completely ordinary day. But other witness accounts soon began to contradict this version of events. Janitor Frank Doherty reported seeing Bryant escorting the 5 children toward the school's rear exit at approximately 2:35 p.m., 15 minutes after they should have returned to their homerooms. When confronted with this discrepancy, Bryant claimed that Doherty must have been mistaken. That she insisted that all students had left her classroom at the normal time. When pressed further, she requested a lawyer, a move that immediately heightened suspicions among both investigators and the increasingly fearful Millbrook community. The investigation's scope expanded dramatically. Every inch of the 8.7-acre school property was searched. Tracking dogs were brought in, but lost any scent trail at the school's rear parking lot, suggesting the children might have left in a vehicle. Law enforcement from neighboring counties joined the effort, and within 48 hours, the FBI had arrived, establishing a larger command center at the Millbrook fire station. Special Agent Kathleen Donovan led the federal response. A veteran of numerous child abduction cases, Donovan brought a methodical approach that contrasted with the increasingly frantic energy pervading the town. Her first action was to establish a timeline, integrating all witness statements, surveillance footage, and physical evidence. The investigation revealed that Woodhaven Elementary had only 4 security cameras in 1987, 1 at the main entrance, 1 monitoring the front office, and 1 in the cafeteria, and 1 overlooking the main hallway, and uncovered the art room corridor, or the rear exit that Doherty had mentioned. The limited footage available showed nothing unusual that day, just the normal comings and goings of a busy elementary school. And for the families of the missing children, the initial days passed in a nightmarish blur. The Keating, Palmer, Warren, Reed, and Gunderson homes became impromptu gathering places, filled with relatives, neighbors, and friends bringing casseroles that went uneaten and offering hollow reassurances that grew less convincing by the hour. Maria Gunderson, Vicky's mother, later described that period in a local newspaper interview. It was like living in a parallel universe. You are going through the motions, talking to police, answering the same questions over and over, looking at photographs, but none of it feels real. The whole time. You are just waiting to wake up from the nightmare. As the investigation continued, Eleanor Bryant remained the primary focus. 2 search warrants were executed at her home, revealing nothing obviously incriminating but several curious items that investigators found worth noting. In her basement, officers discovered a collection of children's drawings far more than would be normal for a teacher to keep. Some dated back several years and appeared to have been organized by child rather than by project or school year. More concerning was a locked filing cabinet containing detailed notes about numerous students, including the 5 missing children. The notes documented personality traits, family situations, and behavioral observations far beyond the scope of normal teacher records. One entry about Jeffrey Palmer stated, highly receptive, minimal parental attention, ideal candidate. When questioned about these materials, Bryant's attorney pointed out that nothing illegal had been discovered, and that dedicated teachers often kept records and mementos of their students' work. The notes, while admittedly unusual, could be explained by Bryant's commitment to understanding her students' individual needs and circumstances. Meanwhile, investigators had begun constructing profiles of each missing child and searching for any commonalities that might explain why these specific 5 students had been targeted. Thomas Reed was the son of divorced parents, living primarily with his mother, a nurse at Millbrook Community Hospital. Described as outgoing and athletic, he had no history of behavioral issues at school. His father, who lived in Ohio, was quickly cleared of any involvement after establishing a solid alibi. Eliza Warren came from one of Millbrook's more affluent families. Her father owned the local hardware store, while her mother served on the town council. Teachers described Eliza as exceptionally bright but somewhat withdrawn, preferring books to social interaction. Jeffrey Palmer lived with his grandmother, his parents having lost custody due to substance abuse issues. Despite his challenging home situation, he was generally well-adjusted, though teachers noted he sometimes sought excessive attention from adult figures. Victoria Gunderson, known to everyone as Vicky, was the daughter of the high school's football coach and a stay-at-home mother. Popular and confident, she participated in community theater and seemed to have a natural talent for art. Daniel Keating was the newest arrival, his family having moved to Millbrook just that summer from Delaware. Quiet and still finding his social footing, Daniel had been seated next to Thomas in their homeroom, and the 2 boys had quickly formed a friendship. On the surface, they seemed to have little in common beyond their age group and assignment to the same art class. Agent Donovan noted, however, that all 5 children came from stable or semi-stable households where they were well cared for, and all had demonstrated some aptitude for art, ranging from Vicky's natural talent to Daniel's enthusiastic, if less skilled, participation. As the investigation entered its 2nd week, a potential breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Millbrook's only motel, the Pinewood Lodge, reported that a guest had checked out hurriedly on the morning of September 15th, the day after the disappearances. The guest, who had paid cash and given the name Arthur Grant, had stayed for 3 nights and requested a room at the rear of the property, facing away from the road. The motel's owner, Harold Weber, told investigators that Grant had been a forgettable man in his late 30s or early 40s, but with no distinguishing features beyond a noticeable limp. Weber recalled that the man had mentioned being in town to visit a sick relative, though he'd offered no specific details. Room 14, where Grant had stayed, yielded little physical evidence. The space had been cleaned thoroughly by housekeeping staff before police arrived. However, one crucial item had been overlooked, a crumpled receipt from a gas station in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, dated September 15th. The receipt showed a purchase made at 6:17 a.m., suggesting that whoever had stayed in the room had traveled east after leaving Millbrook. The investigation now expanded to include this new lead. Agents visited the Harrisburg gas station, obtaining security footage that showed a dark blue van fueling up at the time indicated on the receipt. The vehicle's license plate was partially obscured by mud, but analysts were able to determine it was a Pennsylvania plate beginning with the characters JDL. This information led to a massive search for matching vehicles across the state. 17 potential matches were identified, and each owner was investigated thoroughly. The 16 were quickly eliminated, leaving one van registered to a Jerome D. Lassiter of Philadelphia. Lassiter, 43, had no obvious connection to Millbrook or any of the missing children. His background check revealed a troubling history, a dismissed charge of inappropriate conduct with a minor in 1981, while working as a substitute teacher in New Jersey. The case had been dropped when the alleged victim recanted their statement, but Lassiter had nevertheless moved to Pennsylvania shortly afterward and changed careers, becoming a freelance photographer specializing in school portraits and events. When agents arrived at Lassiter's Philadelphia apartment on September 23rd, they found it empty and apparently abandoned. Neighbors reported that Lassiter had loaded his van with belongings and left approximately 1 week earlier, telling those who asked that he'd accepted a job opportunity in another state. The search of Lassiter's apartment revealed disturbing evidence. Hidden behind a false wall in his bedroom closet, investigators discovered a collection of photographs of children, hundreds of them, many taken surreptitiously in playgrounds, schools, and public parks across Pennsylvania and neighboring states. Among these were several photos of Woodhaven Elementary, including images that appeared to have been taken from the woods behind the school's playground. The most damning of all were 5 folders, each labeled with the name of one of the missing children. Inside were detailed photographs, notes about their routines, and in some cases, small personal items that appeared to have been stolen, even a friendship bracelet belonging to Eliza Warren, a baseball card from Thomas Reed's collection, a hair ribbon identifiable as Vicky Gunderson's. The evidence pointed to a carefully planned abduction, potentially months in the making. But how had Lassiter gained such intimate access to the children? And what was Eleanor Bryant's role in all this? The answer came from an unexpected source. Frank Doherty, the janitor who had initially reported seeing Bryant with the children, came forward with additional information. He recalled that several months earlier, in the spring of 1987, the school had hired a photographer for a special art program documenting students' work for a district-wide exhibition. The photographer, whom Doherty remembered only as Jerry, had spent several days at the school working closely with Eleanor Bryant. School records confirmed that a Jerome Lassiter had indeed been contracted for this purpose in April 1987. Bryant had personally recommended him for the job, claiming to have met him at an educational conference in Pittsburgh the previous year. With this connection established, the focus of the investigation shifted dramatically. Now, rather than considering Bryant as a potential abductor, the investigators began to view her as a possible accomplice, someone who had helped Lassiter identify and access potential victims. Bryant was taken into custody on September 25th for further questioning. After 6 hours of interrogation, she finally broke down, admitting to her role in what she described as the project. According to Bryant's confession, she had met Lassiter not at an educational conference, but through an obscure artistic movement known as the Transcendence Collective. This fringe group believed in identifying and nurturing what they called naturally gifted perception. In children a supposed ability to see and interpret reality in ways adults could not. Bryant claimed that Lassiter had convinced her that the 5 children possessed this rare gift, and that by conventional standards of education and parenting, that their abilities would be suppressed rather than developed. The rescue, as she called it, had been planned for months, with Bryant helping to identify suitable candidates and Lassiter making all logistical arrangements. He promised they wouldn't be harmed, Bryant told investigators, her voice barely above a whisper. And they were special children. He said they needed to be somewhere they could develop properly, away from the limitations of ordinary life. When asked about the children's current whereabouts, Bryant claimed ignorance. According to her statement, Lassiter had not shared his intended destination with her. She believed he had contacts across the country, other members of the Transcendence Collective who maintained remote properties where the children would be raised according to the PIG group's unconventional philosophies. Bryant's confession provided the investigation with new direction but little concrete help in locating the missing children. An extensive search for any information about the Transcendence Collective revealed almost nothing, just vague references in obscure publications and a few cryptic mentions in counterculture newsletters from the late 1970s and early 1980s. Eleanor Bryant was charged with 5 counts of kidnapping and conspiracy. While awaiting trial, she maintained that her actions had been motivated by genuine concern for the children's special abilities. Few in Millbrook believed this explanation, viewing her instead as either delusional or simply evil, a trusted community member who had betrayed her position in the most horrific way imaginable. As for Jerome Lassiter, a nationwide manhunt began immediately. His photograph appeared on television broadcasts across the country. Border patrols and airports received alerts. The FBI added him to their 10 most wanted list. The blue van was discovered abandoned at a long-term parking lot near the Buffalo, New York airport, suggesting he might have fled the country, possibly to Canada. And for the families of the missing children, the revelations brought a strange mixture of hope and deeper despair. The evidence suggested that the abduction had been planned as a rescue rather than for more sinister purposes, potentially increasing the chances that their children were still alive. But yet the seeming vastness of the conspiracy, with its talk of remote compounds and mysterious collectives, made the task of finding them seem more daunting than ever. The town of Millbrook transformed in the wake of the tragedy. The community that had once prided itself on its openness now installed security systems and implemented strict protocols at its schools. Parents who had previously allowed their children to walk to friends' houses or play unsupervised in parks now watched them with anxious vigilance. A generation of children grew up under the shadow of what became known simply as the Woodhaven incident. Throughout the fall and winter of 1987, the search continued. Law enforcement pursued hundreds of leads, many from well-meaning citizens who reported seeing children resembling the missing 5 in locations across the country. None of these sightings produced verifiable results. Bryant's trial began in February 1988. The prosecution presented a compelling case, using her own confession and the evidence found in both her home and Lassiter's apartment to paint a picture of calculated deception and manipulation. Her defense attorney attempted to portray her as another victim, a lonely woman who had fallen under the influence of a charismatic predator, but the jury remained unconvinced. After deliberating for just 4 hours, they returned a guilty verdict on all counts. Bryant was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. As she was led from the courtroom, she turned to the families of the missing children and spoke her final public words. "When they are ready, they will come back. They will show everyone what they have become." The cryptic statement only fueled the pain and confusion of the grieving families. What did she mean? Was it a taunt, a delusion, or did she know something about the children's fate that she still refused to share? Jerome Lassiter remained at large. Despite international cooperation and countless reported sightings, he seemed to have vanished as completely as the children he had taken. Some investigators theorized that he might have established a new identity, perhaps with the help of other members of the Transcendence Collective. Others suspected a darker possibility that Lassiter, realizing the magnitude of the manhunt against him, might have taken his own life in some remote location. As months turned to years, the case gradually receded from national headlines, though it never lost its grip on Millbrook itself. The anniversary of the disappearance was marked each year with a solemn candlelight vigil at Woodhaven Elementary. The school itself continued to operate, though Room 117, the art room, was repurposed as a storage space, with art classes relocated to a newly constructed addition on the opposite side of the building. The families coped in different ways. And the Reeds divorced, with Thomas's father eventually remarrying and having another child, while his mother threw herself into advocacy work for missing children. The Warrens left Millbrook entirely, unable to bear the constant reminders of their loss. Jeffrey Palmer's grandmother passed away in 1992, having never given up hope of his return. The Gundersons established a scholarship foundation in Vicky's name. The Keatings had another child in 1990, a daughter they named Dana, who grew up understanding that she had a brother she would never meet. By the mid-1990s, the active investigation had been scaled back, the case file gathering dust in the archives of the Millbrook Police Department and the regional FBI office. The occasional leads would emerge: a newspaper clipping about a commune in New Mexico with children matching the general descriptions, and a report from a teacher in Oregon who thought one of her new students resembled an age-progressed photo of Eliza Warren, but none proved substantial. In 1998, a development briefly reignited public interest in the case. A woman in Montana contacted authorities claiming to be a former member of the Transcendence Collective. She described a remote compound in the mountains where children were raised according to the group's unconventional philosophies, isolated from mainstream society and taught to believe that they possessed special perceptive abilities. A joint FBI local law enforcement raid on the location revealed a small community of adults and 15 children, but none matched the identities of the Millbrook Five. The compound was eventually determined to be an unrelated alternative living experiment, its residents genuinely unaware of Lassiter or the Woodhaven abductions. Eleanor Bryant died in prison in 2003, taking whatever additional knowledge she might have had to her grave. And her personal effects included hundreds of pages of writings about the Transcendence Collective's beliefs and practices, much of it seemingly delusional. Among these papers was a hand-drawn map, unlabeled but showing what appeared to be a coastal location with structures and pathways marked by cryptic symbols. Forensic analysts and geographers studied the map extensively but could not conclusively match it to any real-world location. Some believed it represented a compound somewhere along the Pacific Northwest coast, while others argued it was merely a product of Bryant's increasingly unstable mind, a fantasy location where she imagined the children thriving under Lassiter's guidance. By the early 2000s, the case had taken on an almost mythical quality. True crime enthusiasts discussed it on early internet forums. Amateur sleuths proposed theories ranging from the plausible to the absurd. A low-budget documentary, The Children of Room 117, was released in 2004, presenting the known facts alongside speculation about the Transcendence Collective's origins and beliefs. But for a new generation of Millbrook residents who had no direct memory of the events, the Woodhaven incident became a kind of local ghost story, a tragedy that had forever altered the town's perception of itself. The parents still warned their children not to talk to strangers, using the case as a cautionary tale. Teenagers would sometimes dare each other to spend the night in the woods behind the elementary school, claiming to hear the whispers of the missing children. The families continued their quiet vigils. Some found ways to move forward while keeping the memories of their children alive. Others remained frozen in their grief, unable to find closure without definitive answers. All of them aged, the young parents of 1987 gradually becoming middle-aged and then elderly, still wondering, still waiting. And then was Teague. In April 2022, nearly 35 years after the disappearances, a discovery in an abandoned property on the Oregon coast would shatter the cold case wide open, revealing a truth more complex and disturbing than anyone in Millbrook could have possibly imagined. April 17, 2022. A spring storm battered the Oregon coastline, driving powerful waves against the rugged cliffs and sending sheets of rain across the landscape. In the small coastal town of Osprey Cove, local real estate agent Donna Mayfield pulled her SUV onto a muddy access road, cursing quietly as the vehicle lurched through deep puddles. She was showing a newly listed property, a long abandoned compound situated on 30 acres of prime oceanfront land, to a developer from Portland. Even in this weather, the property's potential value made the treacherous drive worthwhile. The previous owner died without heirs, Mayfield explained as they approached the main gate, a rusted iron structure nearly hidden by overgrown vegetation. The county seized it for back taxes. Been sitting empty for almost 14 years, from what I understand. What Mayfield and her client discovered that day would reverberate far beyond Oregon's real estate market. Beyond the gate lay a cluster of weathered buildings, a large central structure surrounded by 5 smaller cabins, all constructed in a distinctly modernist style that must have once seemed avant-garde but now appeared eerily anachronistic against the wild coastal backdrop. The main building's front door hung partially open, the lock apparently broken by previous trespassers. Inside, nature had begun its slow reclamation. Water damage stained the ceilings. Moss grew in patches across the concrete floors. Windows broken by storms or vandals had allowed rain, wind, and small animals to wreak havoc on the interior. But it wasn't the building's deteriorated condition that caused Mayfield to call the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office that afternoon. It was what she found in a room at the center of the structure, a large circular space that appeared to have served as some kind of classroom or meeting area. The walls were covered with photographs, hundreds of them, protected from the elements by glass frames. And in the center of the room stood 5 mannequins, arranged in a perfect circle, each wearing clothes that appeared to be decades old and sized for children. It was like walking into a shrine, Mayfield later told investigators, or a museum exhibit about children who never grew up. Sheriff's deputies arrived within the hour. Their initial assessment quickly escalated when they discovered that the photographs covering the walls documented the lives of 5 children from early elementary age through adolescence and into early adulthood. Most disturbing was the realization that the children appeared to be confined to the compound, with no images showing them in any recognizable public locations. By the following morning, the FBI had been contacted. Their special agent Trevor Ramirez, assigned to the Portland field office, recognized the potential significance immediately. Before joining the Bureau, Ramirez had worked in the National Center for Missing Exploited Children, where he'd become familiar with many of the nation's most notorious cold cases, including the 1987 Woodhaven abductions. The 5 children in the photographs bore striking resemblances to age-progressed images of Thomas Reed, Eliza Warren, Jeffrey Palmer, Victoria Gunderson, and Daniel Keating. And further investigation revealed that the property had been purchased in late 1987 by a James Douglas Leonard, a name investigators quickly determined was likely an alias for Jerome Lassiter. Lincoln County records showed that Leonard had paid cash for the property in November 1987, just 2 months after the Millbrook abductions. The seller was listed as the Transcendence Foundation, a corporate entity that had owned the land since 1979, but had apparently never developed it. The transaction had raised no red flags at the time, just another cash sale in a decade known for its sometimes questionable financial dealings. A forensic team descended on the compound, meticulously documenting and collecting evidence from each building. The central structure appeared to have served multiple functions: classroom, dining hall, meeting space, and what investigators described as a documentation center, where the children's development had been photographically recorded with obsessive detail. The 5 smaller cabins told a more personal story. Each was identified with a child's name, not on any external sign but through possessions found within: Thomas, Eliza, Jeffrey, Victoria, and Daniel. Each space had been personalized: Thomas's walls covered with sports posters, Eliza's shelves filled with books, Jeffrey's room containing an elaborate model train set, Victoria's decorated with her own artwork, and Daniel's featuring a collection of geological specimens. Most significant was what investigators found beneath the central building, a climate-controlled basement room containing dozens of filing cabinets. Inside were thousands of pages of records, daily observations, test results, developmental assessments, and journal entries, both from the children themselves and from their captors. From these documents, a disturbing narrative began to emerge. Jerome Lassiter, who referred to himself in the records as the Guardian, had indeed been the leader of what remained of the Transcendence Collective, a group that had largely disbanded by the mid-1980s, but whose core beliefs he had maintained and elaborated upon. Lassiter had been convinced that certain rare children possessed what he called the perception and ability to see patterns and connections in reality that ordinary humans could not. According to his writings, this gift typically manifested around age 7 or 8, but was invariably suppressed by conventional education and socialization. His mission, as he described it, was to rescue such children and provide them with an environment where their abilities could be nurtured rather than extinguished. The records indicated that Eleanor Bryant had been his scout, identifying potential candidates through her position as an art teacher. Lassiter believed that artistically inclined children were more likely to possess the perception, and Bryant had been instructed to watch for specific signs in her students' work: unusual color choices, non-standard perspectives, and what Lassiter termed revelatory symbolism. And over the course of several years, Bryant had identified dozens of potential candidates, but only Thomas, Eliza, Jeffrey, Victoria, and Daniel had met all of Lassiter's criteria. The abduction had been planned months in advance, with Bryant gradually conditioning the children to trust her implicitly and Lassiter making regular visits to Millbrook to observe them from a distance. The documents revealed that after the abduction, the children had been transported across the country in Lassiter's van, sedated during the journey with what he described as low-dose pharmaceuticals to prevent trauma. They had arrived at the Oregon compound on September 19, 1987, 5 days after their disappearance from Woodhaven Elementary. What followed was a 30-year experiment in isolation and indoctrination. The children were told that they had been chosen for their special abilities, that their parents had been unable to understand their gifts, and that the outside world would seek to normalize them if they ever returned. They were promised that when their training was complete, they would be able to use their perception to reshape reality itself. The daily life at the compound was meticulously structured. Mornings were devoted to what Lassiter called conventional education: mathematics, language, science, and history taught using textbooks and materials he acquired during his infrequent trips to nearby cities. Afternoons focused on perceptual development, through meditation, art, music, and various exercises designed to enhance their supposed abilities. The children were not physically abused, according to the records. They were fed nutritious meals, provided with adequate clothing and medical care, and even allowed certain recreational activities. But their psychological manipulation was constant and profound. They were isolated from all outside contact, permitted to communicate only with Lassiter and with each other. They were taught that they were different from and superior to ordinary humans, but also that they were perpetually in danger of being captured and normalized by the outside world. Perhaps most disturbing was the evidence that Lassiter had not been alone in his enterprise. The records mentioned at least 3 other adults who had lived at the compound at various times: a woman identified only as Margaret, who appeared to have served as a teacher and caretaker from 1987 until approximately 1995, a man called Dr. Phillips, who visited several times a year to provide medical checkups and whose handwritten notes suggested he was a licensed physician, and someone referred to as the Observer, who made annual visits to evaluate the children's progress. As investigators pieced together the compound's history, they discovered that the nature of the children's captivity had evolved over time. In the early years, physical security had been paramount. The perimeter was fenced, the gates locked, and the children's cabins secured from the outside at night. But as they entered adolescence, the emphasis shifted to psychological containment. The children, by then teenagers, were gradually granted more freedom of movement around the property, but were continuously reinforced in their belief that the outside world would not understand or accept them. Perhaps the most heartbreaking discovery came from the children's journals, which documented their gradual transition from confusion and homesickness to acceptance of their new reality. The entries from the early months showed desperate longing for their families, questions about why they had been taken, and plans for escape. But over time, these gave way to reflections on their special nature and the important work they were doing at the compound. By their teenage years, their writings showed complete internalization of Lassiter's worldview. 15-year-old Victoria wrote, "Sometimes I try to remember my life before the compound, but it feels like trying to recall a book I read long ago rather than my own experience." The Guardian says this is natural, that as the perception develops, our previous limited existence becomes less relevant to who we truly are. Around 2001, when the oldest of the five would have been 23, the nature of the documents changed significantly. Lassiter's entries became increasingly paranoid, referring to surveillance and attempts at infiltration. He described vivid dreams in which government agents discovered the compound and corrupted his work. His once methodical records became disjointed, with rambling philosophical tangents interrupting his observations of the now adult abductees. The final dated entry in Lassiter's journal was from June 14, 2008. It read simply, "They are ready. The next phase begins." After that, the record went silent. No further journals, no additional photographs on the walls. Something had happened in 2008, but the compound itself provided no clear answers as to what. Forensic analysis revealed more troubling details. In a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards of Lassiter's private quarters, investigators discovered a collection of newspaper clippings about the original disappearances, correspondence with Eleanor Bryant during her imprisonment, conducted through an intermediary using coded language, and 5 forged birth certificates and social security cards presumably created to provide the abductees with false identities. As news of the discovery spread, the FBI formally reopened the Woodhaven case. The original task force had long since disbanded. Detective Lawson had died in 2011, and Special Agent Donovan had retired to Florida in 2003. But the impact on the Millbrook community, and especially on the families of the missing children, was immediate and profound. Thomas Reed's mother, now 73 and living in a retirement community near Pittsburgh, collapsed upon hearing the news and had to be hospitalized briefly. "I never gave up hope," she told reporters from her hospital bed. "But after so many years, you learn to live with the unknown. Now, to think he might still be out there somewhere." Jeffrey Palmer's family had effectively ceased to exist, his grandmother long dead, his father lost to addiction, his mother's whereabouts unknown. But the news reached Victoria Gunderson's parents, both in their 70s and still living in the same Millbrook house, waiting for a daughter who never came home. "We kept her room exactly as it was," Edward Gunderson explained, his voice breaking during a television interview. "Her stuffed animals on the bed, her drawings on the walls. People thought we were torturing ourselves, but we needed to believe she might walk through that door someday." For Daniel Keating's younger sister Dana, born after his abduction, and now 32, the discovery prompted a complex emotional response. "I grew up in the shadow of a brother I never met," she told investigators. "My parents tried to give me a normal childhood, but our family was defined by his absence. Now, to think he might be alive somewhere, living a life completely disconnected from us, it's overwhelming." The search for the 5 abductees began immediately. Their fingerprints were recovered from personal items in the cabins and entered into national databases. DNA samples were collected from items like hairbrushes and toothbrushes and compared with samples provided by family members to confirm their identities. Age-progressed images were created based on the most recent photographs found at the compound, showing how they might look in their early 40s. But despite a nationwide alert and extensive media coverage, no immediate leads emerged. If Thomas, Eliza, Jeffrey, Victoria, and Daniel were still alive, then they had effectively vanished a second time now as adults who might not even recognize their own names or understand that they had been victims rather than the chosen ones Lassiter had convinced them they were. The investigation soon expanded to focus on Jerome Lassiter's final years. Financial records showed that he had maintained a modest bank account in the name of James Leonard at a credit union in Newport, Oregon. Regular withdrawals had supported the compound's operation, with larger sums occasionally removed for what appeared to be bulk supply purchases. The account had last been accessed in July 2008, when a withdrawal of $42,000, nearly the entire remaining balance, had been made in person at the credit union's main branch. Security footage from that date had long since been purged, as but a teller who had worked there for over 20 years vaguely recalled an elderly man with a younger male companion making a large withdrawal, though she could provide no detailed description of either. Property records revealed that ownership of the compound had been transferred in August 2008 to an entity called Perception Holdings LLC, with a mailing address at a virtual office in Seattle. The LLC had paid property taxes through 2009, but then fallen delinquent, leading to the county's eventual seizure of the property. Further investigation into Perception Holdings led to a rented mailbox in Seattle that had been abandoned in 2011. The rental application had been completed by someone using the name Daniel Leonard, potentially suggesting that Daniel Keating, using a surname borrowed from Lassiter's alias, had taken some role in managing the group's affairs after Lassiter's apparent departure or death. A breakthrough came in late May 2022, when a facial recognition system flagged a possible match between the age-progressed image of Victoria Gunderson and a woman living in Tacoma, Washington, under the name Valerie Graham. Local FBI agents conducted surveillance on an apartment complex where utility bills were registered in Graham's name. On May 28, they observed a woman matching Victoria's description, leaving the building. Rather than approaching directly, they followed her to a small art gallery in downtown Tacoma, where she met with 3 other individuals, 2 men, and a woman whose appearances corresponded with the age-progressed images of Thomas Reed, Jeffrey Palmer, and Eliza Warren. After observing their interaction for approximately 40 minutes, agents approached the group, identifying themselves and explaining that they were investigating the 1987 Woodhaven abductions. The response was unexpected. Rather than expressing surprise or attempting to flee, the 4 individuals exchanged glances, and then the woman identified as Victoria Valerie simply said, "We have been waiting for you." For a long time, actually. The 4 agreed to accompany the agents to the Seattle field office for formal interviews. There, over the course of 72 hours, they gradually revealed a story even more complex than investigators had pieced together from the compound records. They confirmed their identities as Thomas, Eliza, Jeffrey, and Victoria, though they had used various aliases over the years, and now thought of their birth names as belonging to previous incarnations. They spoke of their childhoods at the compound with a disturbing mixture of nostalgia and clinical detachment, and describing Lassiter not as an abductor but as a guide who had recognized their potential. He believed we could perceive layers of reality that others couldn't access, Thomas explained, his manner calm and articulate. And to be fair, he wasn't entirely wrong. Not about everything. According to their account, life at the compound had proceeded much as the recovered documents suggested until around 2004, when Lassiter's behavior began to change. His once methodical approach to their development became increasingly erratic. He spoke of receiving messages through dreams, claimed to see patterns in natural phenomena that even his highly conditioned students could not discern, and became obsessed with what he called the culmination, a moment when their collective perception would supposedly allow them to transcend physical reality entirely. Looking back, it's obvious he was experiencing some kind of mental decline, Eliza said. But we'd been raised to believe every word he said. We had no framework for questioning him. The situation deteriorated further after Lassiter suffered what appeared to be a stroke in early 2007. With no medical attention beyond Dr. Phillips' infrequent visits, his condition worsened. By late 2007, he was partially paralyzed and experiencing periods of confusion alternating with intense clarity. It was during this period that the 5 began to privately question the worldview they'd been raised in. Daniel, who had always been the most technically inclined of the group, managed to repair an old radio found in the compound's storage area, giving them their first connection to the outside world. Secretly listening to news broadcasts and music while Lassiter slept, they began to realize how isolated and manipulated they had been. It was like waking up from a dream, Victoria recounted. Or maybe like waking up into a dream. Everything we thought we knew about ourselves and the world started to unravel. Lassiter died in June 2008, not dramatically, but quietly in his sleep. The 5, by then fully grown adults who had never lived independently, were faced with a profound choice: contact authorities and return to families they barely remembered, or attempt to navigate the outside world on their own terms. We were afraid, Jeffrey admitted, not just of how people would react to us, but of how we would react to everything out there. We'd been told our whole lives that we were different, special, that ordinary society would destroy something essential in us. And even though we'd begun to see through Lassiter's manipulation, that fear was deeply ingrained, they chose a middle path. Using the false identification documents Lassiter had created and the money withdrawn from his account, they left the compound together and rented a house in rural Idaho. There, they gradually acclimated to contemporary society, learning to use modern technology, obtaining driver's licenses, and even securing basic employment using their false identities. But they remained together, bound by their shared experience and still partially influenced by Lassiter's teachings. They continued certain practices from the compound: daily meditation, artistic exercises, regular perception sessions, where they would share and analyze their observations of patterns and connections in the world around them. We couldn't bring ourselves to completely abandon everything, Thomas explained. Some of what we learned, the meditation, the focus on pattern recognition, the techniques for detailed observation, those things of value, even if they were taught to us for misguided reasons. Over the next several years, they gradually expanded their engagement with the outside world. They relocated multiple times, living briefly in Montana, then Colorado, then finally settling in the Pacific Northwest in 2014. They established a small collective art studio, selling works under various pseudonyms. They maintained a deliberate distance from others, forming few close relationships outside their group. But there was a notable absence in their account: Daniel Keating. When asked about him, the four exchanged glances before Victoria finally spoke. "Daniel left us in 2016, she said. He'd been having episodes, dreams, visions, periods of what you might call heightened perception. He became convinced that Lassiter had been right after all, that we did possess some special ability that was trying to manifest." According to their account, Daniel had grown increasingly erratic, eventually announcing that he needed to return to the compound to complete the work. They had tried to dissuade him, but he had left one night without warning, taking nothing but a backpack with basic supplies. "We searched for him," Eliza added. "We even went back to the compound once about a year later, but it was already abandoned and falling into disrepair. There was no sign that Daniel had been there. They had not seen or heard from him since, though Thomas admitted they had occasionally received anonymous postcards from various locations that they believed might have been from Daniel. The most recent, received approximately 6 months earlier, had contained only a sketch of 5 interlocking circles and an Oregon postmark. The revelation about Daniel's disappearance added urgency to the investigation. If he was still alive, potentially suffering from delusions connected to Lassiter's teachings, locating him became a priority. A new alert was issued, focusing on the Pacific Northwest but extending nationwide. Meanwhile, investigators faced the delicate task of reuniting Thomas, Eliza, Jeffrey, and Victoria with their families, a process complicated by decades of separation, and the abductees' ambivalence about their own identities, and the advanced age of many family members. The reunions, when they occurred, were complex emotional events, captured in brief, but respectful news coverage that emphasized the need for privacy during this unprecedented situation. Thomas Reed encountered a mother who had aged from a young parent to an elderly woman in what seemed to him like an impossible leap. Victoria Gunderson met not only her parents but a younger brother who had been born after her abduction, a sibling she hadn't known existed. For Jeffrey Palmer, there was no family reunion. His grandmother had died decades earlier, and efforts to locate his parents proved unsuccessful. Eliza Warren's situation was perhaps the most poignant. Her mother had passed away in 2012, never knowing what had happened to her daughter, while her father, now in an assisted living facility with advancing dementia, recognized her only intermittently during their visits. Psychologists specializing in trauma, cult deprogramming, and long-term captivity worked with the 4 adults, helping them process their experiences and adjust to their new reality. The legal ramifications of their situation were complex. While they had been victims of abduction as children, as adults they had used false identification, they potentially committed various forms of fraud, and had chosen not to contact authorities even after learning the truth about their situation. Ultimately, prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions declined to pursue charges, citing the extraordinary circumstances and the decades of psychological manipulation the four had endured. They were granted new, legal identification documents in their birth names, though many continued to use their chosen names in daily life. As for the search for Daniel Keating, it continued throughout the summer and fall of 2022, with investigators following up on possible sightings across the Pacific Northwest. In August, a man matching his description was reported living in a remote cabin near Mount Hood, but by the time authorities reached the location, it was abandoned. In September, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A marine biologist conducting research along the Oregon coast reported encountering a man living in a makeshift shelter on an isolated stretch of beach about 15 miles south of the compound. The man, who appeared to be in his early 40s, had approached the researchers' camp one evening, engaging in an unusual conversation about the patterns in the tides and messages encoded in the movements of seabirds. When authorities located the described shelter on September 17, 2022, they found it recently abandoned but containing personal items that suggested its occupant had indeed been Daniel Keating, including a journal with entries that alternated between lucid reflections on his childhood, abduction, and disturbing passages about completing the perception and rejoining the collective consciousness. The final entry, dated just 2 days earlier, read, 35 years. The cycle completes. I return to where we began, recognizing the significance of the date September 15, 2022, marking exactly 35 years since the day after the abduction. Investigators immediately focused their search on the original compound. Aerial surveillance revealed no obvious signs of activity, but thermal imaging detected a heat signature in the basement area of the main building. A tactical team approached the compound at dawn on September 18th. In the underground room where Lassiter's records had been stored, they found Daniel Keating alive but in a state of extreme psychological distress. The room had been transformed into what one agent described as a three-dimensional representation of a delusional system, the walls covered with intricate drawings, strings connecting various points, and writings in what appeared to be a self-created symbolic language. Daniel offered no resistance when approached. He appeared malnourished and exhausted, but physically unharmed. When asked how long he had been there, he responded only, "I never left. None of us did. We are still here, still trying to see through to the other side." He was transported to a psychiatric facility in Portland, where initial evaluation suggested he was experiencing a complex delusional disorder, likely triggered by the decades of psychological manipulation he had endured and potentially exacerbated by untreated mental health conditions. The discovery and recovery of all 5 abductees brought a formal conclusion to the Woodhaven case, though the psychological, emotional, and philosophical aftermath continued to unfold. Thomas, Eliza, Jeffrey, and Victoria, now legally recognized by their birth names, but still connected by their shared experience, remained in regular contact with each other while attempting to build independent lives. In November 2022, they made their first and only public statement, released through an attorney. "We recognize that our story has captured public attention and raised many questions. We understand the fascination and concern. However, waste being trumped too. We ask for privacy as we continue to process our experiences and build new lives. What happened to us was neither a rescue nor the mystical awakening that Jerome Lassiter claimed. It was a profound violation of our childhoods, of our families' lives, but of our right to develop our own identities. At the same time, it is the only life we knew for decades, and disentangling ourselves from that experience is a complex, ongoing process. To the families of Millbrook who waited so long for answers, we are sorry for the pain our absence caused. That pain was not our choice, but we feel its weight nonetheless. To those who have followed our story with compassion and concern, Thank you for your support. But please understand that we are still learning how to be in this world. And to Daniel, we are here when you are ready. For the patterns you see are real, but their meaning is for you to determine, not anyone else. Daniel Keating remained under psychiatric care, his condition gradually stabilizing with appropriate treatment. By early 2023, he was able to reconnect with his sister Dana and, in limited ways, with his former compound companions. His recovery was described by treating physicians as a process of years, not months, but his prognosis for eventually leading an independent life was cautiously optimistic. The Oregon compound was thoroughly documented by investigators before being raised in January 2023, a decision supported by all 5 former abductees, who expressed no desire to preserve the site of their captivity. The land was eventually purchased by a conservation trust, with plans to incorporate into existing protected coastal habitats. Jerome Lassiter's remains were never found, though forensic analysis of the compound suggested he had indeed died there in 2008, as the abductees claimed. His body had likely been buried somewhere on the property, possibly in an unmarked location that the 5 had chosen not to reveal. Given the circumstances and the passage of time, authorities did not press the issue. The Transcendence Collective itself remained something of a historical enigma. Research by both law enforcement and independent journalists uncovered evidence of its existence as a fringe artistic and philosophical movement in the 1970s, but little suggested it had ever been the organized, far-reaching conspiracy that Lassiter had described to his captives. More likely, he had appropriated and distorted the group's concepts to serve his own obsessions, and perhaps believing his own mythology as deeply as he had forced the children to believe it. For the community of Millbrook, the resolution brought a strange mixture of relief and reopened wounds. The annual candlelight vigil in September 2023, the first since the children had been found, became a celebration of their survival rather than a memorial to their disappearance. Yet the knowledge of what they had endured and the lives they had been denied cast a shadow over any sense of closure. Eleanor Bryant's role in the abduction was reassessed in light of the new evidence. While her complicity remained undeniable, the recovered documents from the compound suggested that Lassiter had manipulated her as well, by exploiting her social isolation and genuine belief in alternative educational philosophies to turn her into an accomplice. This nuance did little to rehabilitate her memory in Millbrook, where her name remained synonymous with betrayal, but it added another layer to the already complex narrative of the case. By the spring of 2024, the story had begun to recede from headlines, though it remained a subject of intense interest in true crime circles and among psychologists studying the long-term effects of isolation and indoctrination. Several books about the case were in development, though all faced the challenge of addressing a story whose principal subjects had explicitly requested privacy. Thomas Reed eventually returned to Pennsylvania, though not to Millbrook itself. He established a small carpentry business in a town near Pittsburgh, occasionally visiting his aging mother but maintaining a deliberately low profile. Eliza Warren relocated to New England, where she enrolled in university courses, pursuing the formal education she had been denied. Jeffrey Palmer, perhaps the most deeply affected by the compound experience after Daniel, chose to live in a small intentional community in rural Washington, but finding comfort in a structured environment that nonetheless respected individual freedom. Victoria Gunderson, who had shown the strongest artistic inclinations during their captivity, continued to create and sell her artwork and developing a modest reputation in Pacific Northwest galleries under a new professional name. She maintained the closest connection with her birth family by regularly visiting her parents and building a relationship with the brother, who had grown up as an only child in her absence. Daniel Keating's journey toward recovery continued, marked by setbacks and breakthroughs. By late 2024, he had progressed to a transitional living facility, where he was learning to manage his condition and gradually reconnecting with the world beyond Lassiter's influence. His sister Dana had become his most consistent supporter, visiting weekly and helping him navigate the overwhelming complexity of contemporary society. What remains most remarkable about the Woodhaven case is not just the children's survival or eventual recovery, but but the resilience they demonstrated in the face of extraordinary circumstances. Abducted before they had formed stable identities, raised in isolation under a distorted worldview, and then thrust into a reality they had been taught to fear, they nevertheless found ways to adapt, to maintain their humanity, and ultimately to reclaim their autonomy. Their story defies simple categorization. They were victims of a terrible crime, yet they emerged as complex individuals who refused to be defined solely by their victimhood. They were indoctrinated into a false belief system, yet they eventually found the capacity to question and ultimately reject it. They were isolated from normal society for decades, yet they developed the skills to navigate that society when finally exposed to it. For the families who had waited so long for answers, the resolution brought a mixture of joy and lingering sorrow. Joy at knowing their children had survived, the sorrow for all the years lost and the ordinary lives they might have lived. For the investigators who had pursued the case across decades, it brought the satisfaction of closure, tempered by the knowledge that no legal resolution could ever truly compensate for what had been taken. And for the five themselves, now middle-aged adults with fractured identities and complex relationships to their own pasts, it brought the challenge of determining who they would become in whatever time remained to them. Not the specially gifted perceivers of Lassiter's delusion, nor the innocent children frozen in their families' memories, but people who had lived through an experience almost no one else could comprehend. In the words that Thomas Reed shared during his single brief interview with the FBI's Victim Services Division, "People ask if we have found closure. But that's not how this works. What happened to us isn't something you close. It's something you carry. The question isn't whether we can put it behind us, we can't. The question is whether we can carry it forward in a way that still allows us to live." As of September 2025, all five continue that process, carrying forward their extraordinary past while attempting to build ordinary futures, then recovering not just their freedom but their right to self-determination. The full impact of their experiences, both on themselves and on our understanding of human resilience and identity, may not be fully understood for many years to come. The Woodhaven case officially remains closed. But for Thomas, Eliza, Jeffrey, Victoria, and Daniel, and for the families and community forever altered by their abduction, the story continues, unfolding not in headlines or case files but in the quiet, daily work of reclaiming lives interrupted nearly 4 decades ago by a man who believed he could see patterns that others could not. In the end, the most profound pattern may be the one they created themselves, 5 lives connected by a shared trauma, yet each finding its own path forward, different routes through the same dark forest, emerging into whatever light remains.